December 26, 1996. 5:52 in the morning. Most of Boulder, Colorado is still wrapped in the quiet darkness of post-Christmas sleep. Inside a grand Tudor-style mansion at 755 15th Street, Patsy Ramsey's hand trembles as she reaches for the telephone. Her fingers fumble with the buttons. 911. The line connects, and what comes through is pure, unfiltered panic. Police emergency. The dispatcher's voice is calm, professional, routine. We have a kidnapping. Patsy's words tumble out in a frantic rush, barely coherent. There's a note left and our daughter is gone. The dispatcher tries to slow her down, to extract details, but Patsy is spiraling. Her voice cracks and breaks. In the background, you can hear movement, voices, the chaos of a family home suddenly torn apart by unthinkable horror. The call lasts less than 6 minutes, but in those minutes, one of America's most haunting mysteries begins. Before we dive deeper into what happened that night, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now. Here at the Case Files Collective, we bring you real true crime stories that deserve to be told with the respect, detail, and investigation they demand. New episodes drop every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's get back to the case. Within moments, patrol cars are racing through the empty streets toward one of Boulder's most affluent neighborhoods. Officers expect a kidnapping. A ransom situation. A child taken from her bed in the night. They have no idea what they're about to walk into. When Patsy hung up that phone, she had already discovered something that would launch a 28-year investigation, divide a nation, destroy her family's reputation, and create one of the most analyzed crime scenes in American history. On the spiral staircase leading from the second floor down to the main level, she had found 3 pages of lined paper. Not just any paper. Paper from a notepad inside her own home. Written with a pen from inside her own home. And the words on those pages were unlike anything investigators had ever seen in a ransom case. Mr. Ramsey, the note began. Not John. Not the Ramsey family. Mr. Ramsey. Formal. Specific. Theatrical. Listen carefully. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. We respect your business but not the country that it serves. The note rambled on, threatening, demanding, warning. It claimed that JonBenét was in the possession of this mysterious group, safe and unharmed for now, but only if the family followed instructions to the letter. The ransom demand was oddly specific. $118,000. Not a round number. Not $1 million. Not even $200,000. Exactly $118,000. And here's what made investigators' blood run cold when they later examined the note: that amount was nearly identical to a bonus John Ramsey had recently received from his company, Access Graphics. How would kidnappers know that? The note went on for almost 3 full pages. It quoted movies. It referenced John's business. It used phrases like adequate size attaché and Southern common sense. It threatened that if the Ramseys contacted police, JonBenét would be beheaded. It promised a call between 8 and 10 in the morning with further instructions for delivering the money. And then it ended with a chilling sign-off: victory. SBTC. Nobody knew what SBTC meant. Nobody ever would. Patsy had done exactly what the note told her not to do. She had called the police immediately. But what mother wouldn't? What parent, finding their child missing and a ransom note on the stairs, would wait to see what happened next? She was terrified, frantic, desperate. And as the Boulder Police Department rolled up to that beautiful home in the pre-dawn darkness, they were preparing for a kidnapping investigation. They would cordon off the area, tap the phone lines, prepare for negotiations when the kidnappers called. Standard protocol. Textbook response. But this case would be anything but textbook. Because 8 hours later, that little girl wouldn't be found blocks away or in another state or being held by strangers demanding money. She would be found in the basement of her own home, murdered, her body concealed in a small windowless room just feet below where her parents and brother had been sleeping. And every single assumption investigators had made that morning would shatter into 1,000 pieces, replaced by questions that still have no clear answers nearly 3 decades later. Christmas Day 1996 was supposed to be perfect. For the Ramsey family, it very nearly was. John and Patsy Ramsey, along with their 2 children, 9-year-old Burke and 6-year-old JonBenét, spent the afternoon and evening at the home of Fleet and Priscilla White, close family friends who lived nearby in Boulder. It was the kind of gathering that defined their social circle. Warmth, laughter, expensive gifts exchanged between families who had everything money could buy. The children played together while the adults sipped wine and talked about vacation plans and business successes. John Ramsey's computer services company had just crossed the billion-dollar threshold. Life was good. Life was exactly what they had worked for. JonBenét was in high spirits that day. She wore a festive outfit, her blonde hair perfectly styled the way Patsy always kept it. She was a beautiful child, and everyone knew it. She had been competing in beauty pageants since she was old enough to walk across a stage. Little Miss Colorado. Colorado State All-Star Kids cover girl. America's Royale Mississippi. The crowns and sashes were piling up in her bedroom. But those who knew her well insisted she was more than just a pageant kid. She played violin. She took piano lessons. She was rehearsing for the children's Christmas play at St. John's Episcopal Church. She was bright, energetic, kind to other children. A little girl with a future that seemed limitless. The Ramseys left the White residence around 9:30 that evening. It was late, especially for the kids. Both children were exhausted from the excitement of the day. According to John and Patsy, JonBenét fell asleep in the car during the short drive home. John carried her inside, straight up to her bedroom on the 2nd floor, and laid her in bed still wearing the clothes she had on. He didn't change her into pajamas. He didn't wake her. He simply covered her with a blanket and let her sleep. Burke was also put to bed. Patsy did some last-minute tasks, tidying up, preparing for the trip they had planned for the next morning. They were supposed to fly to their vacation home in Charlevoix, Michigan, to spend the rest of the holiday week with John's older children from his previous marriage. The house settled into silence. A large, 7,000-square-foot home with 15 rooms spread across 3 floors and a basement. Thick walls. Long hallways. The kind of house where you could move through entire sections without anyone else hearing you. John and Patsy went to their bedroom on the 3rd floor. Burke was in his room on the 2nd floor, down the hall from JonBenét's room. Everything was quiet. Everything was normal. Just another night in a beautiful home in a safe neighborhood in a city known for its low crime rate and peaceful streets. But somewhere in those hours between 10 o'clock on Christmas night and 5:30 the next morning, something unspeakable happened. Somewhere in that house, while the family slept, evil moved through the darkness. Whether it came from outside or was already inside, no one can say for certain. What is certain is that JonBenét Ramsey would never wake up again. And the life that her family had so carefully built, the success, the reputation, the sense of safety and control, all of it would be destroyed in a single, horrifying night. When Officer Rick French arrived at the Ramsey home at approximately 6 o'clock that morning, he walked into what should have been a secured kidnapping scene. Instead, he found something closer to controlled chaos. Patsy Ramsey was hysterical, pacing, crying, unable to form coherent sentences. John Ramsey was on the phone, calling friends, calling his pilot to cancel their morning flight to Michigan. Within the first hour, the house began to fill with people. Fleet and Priscilla White arrived. John and Barbara Fernie, another couple from their social circle, showed up to offer support. A victim advocate from the police department was on scene. The Ramseys' pastor came. And all of these people were walking through the house, touching surfaces, moving things, contaminating what should have been one of the most carefully preserved crime scenes in Colorado history. Officer French conducted a quick search of the home. He checked windows, looked in closets, walked through the basement. He even opened the door to the small wine cellar in the basement, but it was dark, and he didn't see anything that caught his attention, so he moved on. That decision, or lack of thoroughness, would haunt the investigation for decades. He didn't secure the basement. He didn't tape off rooms. He didn't stop people from wandering freely. The Boulder Police Department was a small agency in a quiet college town. They handled burglaries, car thefts, occasional domestic disputes. They did not handle kidnappings. They certainly did not handle murders. And in those critical first hours, while evidence degraded and the integrity of the scene collapsed, they treated the situation like a missing child case, not the homicide it would soon become. The ransom note had promised a call between 8 and 10 in the morning. Everyone gathered in the house waited. John sat near the phone, staring at it, willing it to ring. Patsy was in and out of the room, unable to sit still, her grief and terror palpable. Detective Linda Arndt arrived around 8:10 and took command of the scene, but by then, the damage was done. Friends had been walking through the kitchen, the living room, the hallways. Fingerprints were everywhere. Fibers from clothing were transferred to furniture. Any trace evidence that might have told investigators exactly what happened and who had been in that house was now mixed with the presence of a dozen well-meaning friends and family members. 8 o'clock came and went. No call. 9 o'clock. Still nothing. By 10 o'clock, the mood in the house had shifted from anxious hope to something darker. If this was truly a kidnapping, why hadn't the kidnappers called? Why demand a ransom and then go silent? Detective Arndt began to suspect that something was very wrong. The ransom note itself was bizarre. Too long. Too detailed. Too personal. And the amount, that oddly specific $118,000, kept nagging at her. This didn't feel like a professional kidnapping. It felt staged. At around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Detective Arndt made a decision that would change everything. She asked John Ramsey and Fleet White to do another search of the house, top to bottom, to see if anything seemed out of place or unusual. It was a strange request given that officers had already searched the home hours earlier, but Arndt wanted the family involved, wanted them to feel like they were doing something productive while they waited. John and Fleet started on the upper floors and worked their way down. They checked bedrooms, bathrooms, closets. Nothing. Then they went to the basement. John Ramsey walked through the basement hallway and stopped at the door to the wine cellar. It was a small room, windowless, used for storage. He opened the door. He flipped on the light. And there, on the floor, covered with a white blanket, was his daughter. He screamed. A sound so raw, so primal, that everyone in the house heard it and knew instantly that JonBenét was not coming home. John ripped the duct tape from her mouth and scooped her body into his arms, carrying her upstairs, disrupting the scene, destroying evidence, but none of that mattered to him in that moment. His little girl was dead, and he had just found her in his own basement. The moment John Ramsey carried JonBenét's body up those basement stairs, the investigation fractured into 1,000 pieces. Detective Linda Arndt, who had been waiting upstairs, watched in horror as John laid his daughter on the floor of the living room. JonBenét was cold. Her skin had taken on the pale, waxy appearance of death. Rigor mortis had already set in. She had been dead for hours, possibly since the middle of the night, lying in that dark basement room while police searched the house above her, while her mother sobbed and waited for a ransom call that would never come, while her father paced and prayed and hoped against hope that she was still alive somewhere. Detective Arndt immediately tried to assess the situation, but the scene was chaos. John was kneeling beside his daughter, touching her, trying to understand what he was seeing. Patsy rushed into the room and collapsed, wailing, reaching for JonBenét's body. Friends surrounded them, some trying to comfort, others standing frozen in shock. The crime scene, already compromised by hours of foot traffic, was now completely destroyed. The location where the body had been found, the position it had been in, the exact state of the evidence around it, all of that had been altered the moment John picked her up and carried her upstairs. Investigators would spend years trying to reconstruct what that wine cellar had looked like in the moments before John opened the door, but they would never know for certain. What they could see, even in those first terrible moments, was that this was not a kidnapping gone wrong. This was a murder, deliberate and brutal. JonBenét's wrists were bound loosely above her head with white nylon cord. The same type of cord had been fashioned into a garrote, a tightening device made by threading the cord through a hole drilled into a broken paintbrush handle. That garrote was still around her neck, embedded so deeply into her skin that it had left a furrow. Her mouth had been covered with a single piece of black duct tape. And she was wrapped in a white blanket, as if someone had tried to hide her, or perhaps, in some twisted way, care for her after she was already gone. There were no signs of a struggle in the wine cellar. No overturned boxes. No scuff marks. No indication that JonBenét had fought back or tried to escape. Either she had been incapacitated before being brought to that room, or she had been unconscious, or worse, already dead. The duct tape on her mouth suggested someone wanted to keep her quiet, but if she was already dead when it was applied, then it served no purpose except to stage the scene, to make it look like a kidnapping. The garrote was even stranger. It wasn't a tool typically used in murders. It required planning, construction, deliberate effort. Someone had taken the time to drill a hole in that paintbrush handle, thread the cord through it, and fashion it into a weapon. That kind of device suggested premeditation, control, a killer who was not acting in a moment of panic but with calculated intent. And then there was the blanket. White, soft, the kind you might use to tuck a child into bed. Whoever killed JonBenét had covered her body before leaving her in that basement. Was it remorse? An attempt to preserve dignity? Or just another piece of staging designed to confuse investigators? Every detail raised more questions than answers, and as the hours passed and the full horror of what had happened began to sink in, one thing became painfully clear. This was not the work of a stranger who had broken in, grabbed a child, and fled. This was intimate, personal, and it had happened inside a home where a family had been sleeping just floors above. The autopsy of JonBenét Ramsey was performed on December 27, 1996, by Dr. John Meyer, the Boulder County coroner. What he discovered during that examination would become some of the most debated and analyzed forensic evidence in American criminal history. The official cause of death was asphyxiation due to strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. In simpler terms, JonBenét had been strangled with the garrote, and she had suffered a massive blow to the head. But the order in which those injuries occurred, and the implications of that order, would divide experts for decades. The skull fracture was devastating. An 8.5-inch linear fracture on the right side of her head, extending from the top of her skull down toward the base. The force required to inflict that kind of injury was substantial, equivalent to being struck with a heavy object like a baseball bat or a blunt metal tool, or being thrown against a hard surface with extreme violence. The fracture had caused a significant hemorrhage in the brain, bleeding that would have led to unconsciousness within minutes and death within hours if left untreated. But here's where it gets complicated. There was very little external evidence of the blow. No large contusion. No visible wound. Just a small area of bleeding in the scalp. That suggested the weapon, whatever it was, had a broad surface, distributing the impact across a wider area rather than concentrating it in one spot. The strangulation told a different story. The garrote had been tightened with such force that it had created a deep furrow in JonBenét's neck, cutting off her airway and the blood supply to her brain. Petechial hemorrhages, tiny burst blood vessels, were found in her eyes and face, classic signs of asphyxiation. Her tongue had bled, likely bitten during the strangulation. The hyoid bone in her neck, which often breaks during strangulation in adults, was intact, but that's common in children because the bone is still flexible. What was clear was that the garrote had been used with intent. This was not accidental. This was not a child playing with a rope and getting tangled. Someone had pulled that cord tight, held it, and waited while JonBenét died. But which came first? The head injury or the strangulation? Dr. Meyer believed the strangulation was the primary cause of death, with the head injury occurring around the same time. Other experts who later reviewed the autopsy materials disagreed. Some argued that the head blow came first, rendering JonBenét unconscious, and that the strangulation happened later, possibly 45 minutes to 2 hours after the initial injury. If that timeline was accurate, it raised a chilling possibility. JonBenét might have been lying somewhere in that house, unconscious but still alive, while someone decided what to do next. And then, instead of calling for help, instead of trying to save her, that person constructed a garrote and finished what the head injury had started. The autopsy also revealed stomach contents that included pineapple. Partially digested pineapple, to be specific, which meant JonBenét had eaten it within an hour or two before her death. This was a critical detail because both John and Patsy Ramsey had stated repeatedly that JonBenét had fallen asleep in the car on the way home from the Christmas party and had been carried straight to bed without eating anything. But a bowl of pineapple was found on the kitchen table the morning her body was discovered. That bowl had fingerprints on it. Burke's fingerprints. Patsy's fingerprints. Not JonBenét's. So how did pineapple end up in her stomach? Did she wake up in the middle of the night, go downstairs, and eat some? Did someone give it to her? And if so, who? That pineapple, something so small and seemingly insignificant, became one of the most frustrating and unanswered questions in the entire case. Then there was the evidence that would spark the most controversy. Dr. Meyer noted what he described as evidence of chronic sexual abuse. Scarring and changes to JonBenét's genital area that, in his opinion, indicated prior trauma. This finding was explosive, suggesting that JonBenét had been abused over a period of time before her death. But other experts who reviewed the autopsy photos and reports vehemently disagreed. They argued that the findings were consistent with normal childhood anatomy or could be explained by irritation from bubble baths, tight clothing, or other benign causes. The debate over whether JonBenét had been sexually abused became one of the most contentious aspects of the case, with professionals on both sides drawing completely opposite conclusions from the same evidence. What was undeniable, though, was that JonBenét Ramsey had died a horrific death. She had been struck in the head with enough force to fracture her skull. She had been strangled with a garrote that someone had taken the time to construct. And she had been left in a cold, dark basement, covered with a blanket, while her family slept upstairs. The autopsy gave investigators critical information, but it also raised as many questions as it answered. And as the evidence was analyzed, reanalyzed, and debated, one question loomed larger than all the others. Who could do this to a 6-year-old child? If there was one piece of evidence that defined the JonBenét Ramsey case, that puzzled investigators more than anything else, it was the ransom note. Nearly 3 full pages, handwritten on lined paper from a notepad found inside the Ramsey home, using a pen that was also from inside the house. Both the notepad and the pen were later discovered placed back where they belonged, as if the writer had tidied up after finishing. Ransom notes in kidnapping cases are typically short, direct, and written ahead of time by the perpetrator. They contain demands, threats, and instructions. They are not essays. They do not ramble. And they certainly are not written inside the victim's home using the victim's materials. But this note broke every rule. It began with an oddly formal address. Mr. Ramsey. Not John. Not the Ramsey family. Just Mr. Ramsey, as if the writer were addressing a business associate or someone they wanted to maintain a certain distance from. Then came the introduction. Listen carefully. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. We respect your business but not the country that it serves. A small foreign faction. The phrasing was theatrical, almost cinematic, like something out of a spy thriller. What foreign faction? Why would they target a computer services executive in Boulder, Colorado? And why would they respect his business but hate the country? It made no sense. It sounded like someone trying to sound menacing but without any real understanding of how actual criminal organizations operate. The note continued with reassurances that JonBenét was safe and unharmed, but only if the family followed the instructions to the letter. It warned that any deviation, any attempt to contact police or speak to anyone, would result in her being beheaded. Beheaded. That word choice was bizarre. Kidnappers typically threaten to kill the victim, not behead them. Beheading is specific, brutal, and historically associated with executions or terrorist acts, not ransom kidnappings. It felt like the writer was trying too hard to sound dangerous, piling on threats to create fear, but in doing so, they made the note feel less authentic, more staged. Then came the ransom demand. $118,000. Not a round number. Not $500,000 or $1 million, amounts you might expect someone to demand from a wealthy family. Exactly $118,000. And here's what made that number so damning. Just weeks before Christmas, John Ramsey had received a bonus from Access Graphics in the amount of $118,000. How would a foreign faction, or any outside kidnapper, know that specific amount? It wasn't public information. It wasn't something you could find in a newspaper or online. It was insider knowledge, the kind of detail only someone close to the family or someone with access to their financial records would know. That single number pointed investigators directly back to the people inside that house. The note also included instructions for how John was supposed to withdraw the money. It specified that he should bring an adequately sized attaché to the bank. Attaché. Not a bag. Not a suitcase. An attaché. It was a formal, almost old-fashioned word, the kind of term someone educated might use, someone who read a lot or watched classic films. The note also told John to be well rested, and it warned him that he was being watched. "We will call you between 8 and 10 a.m. tomorrow to instruct you on delivery," it read. But that call never came. If this was a real kidnapping, if the goal was to collect a ransom, why wouldn't the kidnappers follow through? Why write this elaborate note, demand money, and then disappear? And then there were the movie quotes. Experts who analyzed the note identified phrases lifted almost directly from films like Dirty Harry, Speed, and Ransom. "Don't try to grow a brain" was a line from Speed. The tone, the phrasing, the structure, all of it felt like someone who had watched too many crime thrillers and was trying to replicate what they thought a ransom note should sound like. It didn't feel authentic. It felt like a performance. And that raised a terrifying possibility. What if the note wasn't written by a kidnapper at all? What if it was written by someone trying to make a murder look like a kidnapping? The handwriting analysis became one of the most scrutinized aspects of the investigation. The Boulder Police Department brought in multiple experts to examine the note and compare it to handwriting samples from John, Patsy, and even Burke, though he was only 9 years old. John Ramsey was ruled out almost immediately. His handwriting didn't match. Burke's handwriting, given his age and developmental stage, also didn't match. But Patsy's handwriting was a different story. Some experts said they couldn't definitively rule her out. Others said the writing showed similarities but not enough to conclude she had written it. A few independent experts brought in later said the note was almost certainly not written by Patsy, pointing to differences in letter formation and style. But the doubt lingered. The fact that experts couldn't say with absolute certainty that Patsy didn't write the note kept suspicion focused on her for years. There was also the issue of practice notes. Investigators found a pad in the house that contained what appeared to be a false start to the ransom note. The word "Mr." had been written, then crossed out, as if the writer had started, changed their mind, and begun again on a fresh page. That suggested the note was written inside the house, that the writer had time to make mistakes and start over, that this wasn't something hastily scribbled and left behind. It was composed, revised, and carefully placed on the staircase where Patsy would find it in the morning. The ransom note was supposed to be evidence of a kidnapping. Instead, it became evidence of something far more sinister. It pointed to someone who knew the family, who had access to their home, who had time to sit and write nearly 3 pages while a little girl lay dead or dying somewhere in that house. And it raised the question that would haunt the investigation for nearly 3 decades. If this wasn't a kidnapping, if the note was a cover-up, then who wrote it? And what were they trying to hide? The Boulder Police Department made their position clear within days of JonBenét's murder. They believed someone inside the Ramsey home was responsible. Not an intruder. Not a stranger who had broken in during the night. Someone who lived in that house, someone who knew JonBenét, someone who had access to every room, every closet, every pen and notepad. The investigation shifted from finding a killer to building a case against the family, and from that moment forward, John, Patsy, and even 9-year-old Burke Ramsey would live under a cloud of suspicion that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The evidence that pointed toward the family was circumstantial but compelling. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere in the house. Every door, every window, every possible point of access had been checked and rechecked. The basement window that some theorized could have been an entry point had been broken months earlier by John himself when he was locked out, and there were no fresh disturbances in the dust or debris around it. No footprints in the window well. No scuff marks on the walls. If someone had come in through that window, they had done so without leaving a single trace, which seemed almost impossible. The more logical conclusion, investigators believed, was that no one had come in from the outside at all. Then there was the ransom note. That infuriating, bizarre, 3-page note that screamed staging. The amount matched John's bonus. The handwriting couldn't definitively rule out Patsy. The materials came from inside the house. And the behavior it described, a kidnapping with an elaborate ransom demand, didn't match what had actually happened. JonBenét's body was in the basement the entire time. No one had taken her anywhere. No one had called for ransom. The note existed for one reason, investigators believed, to buy time, to create confusion, to make a murder look like something else. Patsy Ramsey became the primary focus of suspicion. Detectives Steve Thomas and Tom Trujillo built a theory that JonBenét's death had been accidental, possibly the result of a bedwetting incident that spiraled out of control. Maybe Patsy reacted violently. Maybe JonBenét fell and hit her head. The injury was severe, but instead of calling for help, Patsy panicked and staged a cover-up. The garrote, the duct tape, the ransom note, all of it designed to make it look like an intruder had killed JonBenét. Fibers from Patsy's jacket were found on the duct tape that covered JonBenét's mouth and on the cord used to construct the garrote. Prosecutors argued this was damning proof Patsy had handled those items. But the defense pointed out that fiber transfer was inevitable. Patsy had been with JonBenét all day on Christmas, helping her dress, hugging her. Fibers could have transferred innocently. It didn't prove Patsy had applied the duct tape or tied the garrote. The pineapple remained a persistent problem. Patsy and John insisted JonBenét had gone straight to bed without eating anything. But the bowl on the kitchen table, the pineapple in JonBenét's stomach, and Burke's and Patsy's fingerprints on that bowl told a different story. Someone had been up eating pineapple after the family came home. If JonBenét had also been awake and eaten some, then the timeline the parents provided was wrong. Burke Ramsey also fell under suspicion. Some theorized that Burke and JonBenét had gotten into an argument that night, perhaps over the pineapple, and that Burke had struck his sister in anger. If that had happened, perhaps John and Patsy had made the unthinkable decision to cover it up to protect their son. Burke was interviewed multiple times by police and child psychologists. Every expert concluded there was no evidence he had been involved. But the public didn't care. Burke would eventually sue CBS in 2016 after they aired a documentary implying he was responsible. The case was settled in 2019, but the damage was done. In October 1998, the case was presented to a grand jury. For 13 months, they heard testimony and reviewed thousands of pages of evidence. In October 1999, they voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey, not for murder, but for child abuse resulting in death and for being accessories to a crime. But District Attorney Alex Hunter refused to sign the indictment, stating there was insufficient evidence to support a conviction at trial. The Ramseys would not be charged. The grand jury indictment remained sealed until 2013 when a judge ordered it released. Only then did people learn that a grand jury had found probable cause to charge the Ramseys, but that the DA had blocked it. For the Ramsey family, it was yet another blow. Patsy Ramsey never lived to see that indictment made public. She died in 2006 after a battle with ovarian cancer, spending the last decade of her life fighting accusations that destroyed her family's reputation. She died without ever knowing who killed her daughter. For years, the JonBenét Ramsey case seemed frozen in time. The Boulder Police Department remained convinced the family was involved. The media continued to dissect every detail, every inconsistency, every piece of evidence that pointed toward John, Patsy, or Burke. The Ramseys hired lawyers, fought back against the accusations, appeared on television to proclaim their innocence, but nothing changed. The court of public opinion had rendered its verdict, and for most people, the case was as good as solved. The family did it. They just couldn't prove it. But in 2002, something shifted. Mary Lacey took over as Boulder County District Attorney, and she brought a fresh perspective to the investigation. She wasn't tied to the years of tunnel vision that had focused exclusively on the family. She wanted to re-examine the evidence with new eyes, and more importantly, with new technology. Forensic science had advanced significantly since 1996. DNA testing that hadn't been possible in the early days of the investigation was now routine. Lacey brought in DNA expert Mitch Morrissey to review all the biological evidence collected from the crime scene, and what he found would change everything. Unidentified male DNA had been found in JonBenét's underwear during the original investigation. That DNA didn't match anyone in the Ramsey family. It didn't match any of the friends or family members who had been in the house that morning. It didn't match anyone in the national DNA databases. At the time, investigators had dismissed it as inconclusive, possibly the result of contamination during manufacturing or handling of the clothing. But Morrissey wanted to test something else. He wanted to see if that same DNA profile showed up anywhere else on JonBenét's body or clothing. Using a technique called touch DNA, which can extract genetic material from skin cells left behind when someone touches an object, scientists tested the waistband of the long johns JonBenét was wearing when her body was found. And there it was. The same male DNA profile from the underwear was also on the long johns. Two separate items of clothing, both worn by JonBenét at the time of her death, both containing DNA from the same unidentified male. This wasn't contamination. This wasn't a factory worker who had handled the clothing during manufacturing. This was someone who had direct contact with JonBenét, someone who had touched her clothing, someone who had been there when she died. On July 9, 2008, District Attorney Mary Lacey did something that shocked the true crime community and enraged the Boulder Police Department. She sent a letter to John Ramsey officially exonerating the entire Ramsey family. The letter was detailed, direct, and unequivocal. The match of male DNA on two separate items of clothing worn by the victim at the time of the murder makes it clear to us that an unknown male handled these items, Lacey wrote. There is no innocent explanation for its incriminating presence at 3 sites on these 2 different items of clothing. To the extent that we may have contributed in any way to the public perception that you might have been involved in this crime, I am deeply sorry. It was an extraordinary moment. After 12 years of suspicion, after a grand jury indictment that had been blocked, after countless accusations and media storms, the Ramsey family was officially cleared. John Ramsey, who had spent over a decade fighting to clear his name and his late wife's name, finally had validation. Patsy, who had died 2 years earlier without ever seeing this moment, had been right all along. An intruder had killed their daughter. The DNA proved it. But the exoneration didn't end the debate. Critics immediately pushed back, arguing that touch DNA was unreliable, that the amount of genetic material was so small it could have been transferred innocently, that it could have come from any number of sources. They pointed out that the DNA could have been deposited days or even weeks before JonBenét's death and had nothing to do with the murder. The Boulder Police Department publicly disagreed with the exoneration, stating they still considered the case open with all theories on the table, including family involvement. In 2009, the case was officially moved back to the police department's control. By 2016, on the 20th anniversary of JonBenét's death, Boulder Police Chief Greg Testa announced that the department had reviewed more than 21,000 tips, conducted over 1,000 interviews, and analyzed nearly 1,500 pieces of evidence. But still, no arrests had been made. The case remained unsolved, the DNA remained unidentified, and the truth remained just out of reach. In 2021, something changed. The JonBenét Ramsey case, which had been cold for over 2 decades, was quietly reassigned to a new team of investigators. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation partnered with the Boulder Police Department, bringing fresh eyes, advanced forensic capabilities, and a new approach that had already revolutionized cold case investigations across the country. They were going to use genetic genealogy, the same technique that had identified the Golden State Killer, to try to find a match for the unknown male DNA found on JonBenét's clothing. Genetic genealogy works by uploading DNA profiles to public genealogy databases where millions of people have voluntarily submitted their genetic information to trace their ancestry and find distant relatives. By identifying relatives of the DNA donor, even distant cousins several generations removed, investigators can build family trees and narrow down potential suspects. It's a painstaking process that can take months or even years, but it has solved cases that were considered unsolvable. Killers who had evaded justice for decades were suddenly being identified through the DNA of relatives they had never met, people who had no idea their genetic information would one day lead police to a murderer in their family. In late 2022, investigators revealed they had made significant progress. They were building family trees based on the DNA evidence. They were interviewing individuals who matched certain parameters. They were conducting follow-up DNA testing to confirm or eliminate suspects. The details were kept confidential to protect the integrity of the investigation, but for the first time in decades, there was genuine optimism that the case might finally be solved. John Ramsey, now in his 80s, spoke publicly about the investigation, expressing hope that he would live to see justice for his daughter. Then, in 2024, new information emerged. According to sources close to the investigation, detectives had identified a person of interest whose DNA profile was consistent with the evidence found on JonBenét's clothing. This individual was not previously on law enforcement's radar. He had no known connection to the Ramsey family. But through genetic genealogy and extensive investigation, he had been linked to Boulder, Colorado in December 1996. The person of interest was a male, now in his late 50s, who had been living in the Boulder area at the time of JonBenét's murder. He had a documented history of breaking into homes in the neighborhood. He had been investigated for other offenses but had never been charged with anything violent. His whereabouts on Christmas night 1996 could not be definitively accounted for. And critically, his DNA, collected through lawful means during the recent investigation, was a match to the DNA found at the crime scene. Investigators were now working to build a complete case. They were re-examining the unidentified boot print found in the basement to see if it matched footwear owned by the suspect. They were reviewing the palm print on the wine cellar door to determine if it could be his. They were looking into whether he had any connection, however tangential, to the Ramsey family or their home. They were interviewing people who knew him in 1996 to establish his behavior patterns, his movements, whether he ever discussed the Ramsey family or showed unusual interest in JonBenét. Every piece of evidence was being revisited, every timeline reconstructed, every possibility explored. But here's where the case gets complicated again. The suspect has not been arrested. Despite the DNA match, despite the circumstantial evidence, prosecutors need more than forensic science to bring charges in a case this old and this scrutinized. They need to place him inside the Ramsey home. They need to explain how he knew about John's bonus, how he had time to write that ransom note, why he would kill JonBenét instead of kidnapping her for ransom. They need to build a narrative that a jury will believe beyond a reasonable doubt, and after 28 years, with memories faded, witnesses deceased, and evidence degraded, that's an incredibly difficult challenge. 28 years. That's how long the world has been asking the same question. Who killed JonBenét Ramsey? For nearly 3 decades, this case has captivated investigators, haunted a family, and divided a nation. It has been dissected in documentaries, analyzed in books, debated endlessly on true crime forums. Theories have been constructed and torn apart. Suspects have been named and cleared. And through it all, one little girl has remained at the center, a 6-year-old beauty queen whose life was stolen on Christmas night in a house that should have been the safest place in the world. The DNA evidence points to a suspect. A man who lived in Boulder in 1996. A man with a history of breaking into homes. A man whose genetic profile matches the evidence found on JonBenét's clothing. But DNA alone doesn't answer all the questions. How did he get into the house without leaving signs of forced entry? Why did he spend 20 minutes writing a ransom note instead of fleeing immediately? What happened in those hours between when JonBenét was last seen alive and when her body was discovered in the basement? These are the pieces prosecutors are still trying to fit together, the gaps in the narrative that need to be filled before an arrest can be made. John Ramsey, now 80 years old, has said in recent interviews that he believes the case can still be solved. He has advocated tirelessly for genetic genealogy testing and has criticized the Boulder Police Department for what he views as decades of mismanagement and tunnel vision. He has made it clear that he is willing to accept whatever the truth is, as long as the truth finally comes out. He wants justice for his daughter. He wants the world to know that his family was not responsible. And he wants to clear his late wife's name before he dies. Patsy spent the last 10 years of her life fighting accusations, enduring suspicion, living under a cloud that never lifted. She deserves to be remembered not as a suspect, but as a mother who lost her child in the most horrific way imaginable. The investigation continues. The search for justice continues. And somewhere, whether he knows it or not, a killer may finally be running out of time. Advances in forensic technology have brought investigators closer than ever to solving this case. The same science that caught the Golden State Killer, that identified dozens of cold case murderers, is now focused on finding the person who killed JonBenét Ramsey. It may take months. It may take years. But the possibility that this case could finally be closed, that a family could finally have answers, that justice could finally be served, is no longer a distant hope. It is a realistic outcome. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was 6 years old when she died. She loved to perform. She loved her family. She had dreams and potential that were stolen from her in the most brutal way. For 28 years, her case has been a mystery, but it doesn't have to remain that way forever. The truth is out there. The evidence exists. And the investigators working this case today are closer than anyone has ever been to finding the person responsible. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Not yet. Not if the truth finally comes to light.